it on mute. Right, so conducting the environmental analysis, the macro environmental analysis. So the other option available, and we've seen this one before, obviously the SWOT analysis. Please remember to take a picture of that and shove it on the group if you don't mind. I see that messages have come through on the group already. And then the pestle approach. Now we know the pestle approach. I don't particularly like the pestle approach. And the only issue that I have with the pestle approach is that I prefer that you don't separate political and legal, because those two go hand in hand. Otherwise, the pestle approach gives us a really good option in terms of looking at what is out in the environment. It allows us to focus on the key elements. Some of the challenges associated, obviously, would be those subtleties and those connectivities that are not obvious to the eye and sometimes are very, very subtle. And also the fact that we have those novelties that we have to deal with. Right. So other options available, and these are just, again, best practices that are available. I think when we look at the issues priority matrix, the key thing is to avoid that. And remember, the other word for myopia is short-sightedness. So often what will happen is that organizations get into a success groove. Organizations get into a comfort zone, and they get used to doing business in a particular way. And all of a sudden, the changes in the environment essentially suggests to them that their business model might not be perfect. But instead of changing the business model, what we do is we simply ignore negative information. We treat them as rumors. We treat them as less important. We believe that our own resources and our own capabilities and our own best practices and our brand will be able to actually counteract whatever comes in the environment. And the silly example, and I've used this example a number of times, is iPhone introduces the touchscreen, and Nokia believes that the touchscreen phone would never become a reality. So their traditional approach was the candy bar design with the buttons and rubbish like that. So the negative information that came out of the environment, or the threat that they would have seen, essentially is reinterpreted as something that's a gimmick and something that's not going to be around forever. So what this matrix does, it gives us an idea of a range of things, but it allows us to look at these critically important developments. And the first one is that we look at the emerging trends, and in particular, in terms of the macro environment, in terms of the industry environment. The second one is that we then take those trends and we try and assess, and remember, this is where you need objectivity. You cannot allow individuals to essentially let the business model supersede logic and common sense and things like that. And what we do is we then look at the probability of these actually becoming a reality. So it's sort of separating what is a moment in time gimmick versus what is the future of in terms of the iPhone versus Nokia, the new technology. And then to look at the likely impact. So each of those trends that you identify is you look at it from two perspectives. Is this something that is likely to appear? And then also, how big will its impact be on the organization? So if something is of high probability and will have significant impact, you jump on it and you fix it immediately. Can someone please also just take a picture of that and put it on the group? Scenario analysis and planning. Now, we have a couple of scenario gurus in South Africa, Clem Sunter being one of them. And if you ever get an opportunity, read some of Clem Sunter's stuff. Really, really well written. I think the website is still The Mind of a Fox, and suggesting that you have to think like a fox, because the truth is the world is so ridiculous out there that the changes are going to be so rapid that you have to be on your toes all the time. So from a scenario analysis is where we look at the broader business environment. And please note, and here we talk about the I spent factors, and it's international, social, political, economic, natural, and technological. In terms of political, legal, obviously included in that. So you look at every country. The country looks at those potential factors, and then we look at certain triggers that would identify whether a certain scenario is unfolding. Now, again, we were told that the war in the Ukraine would happen, and all of a sudden, some countries were caught off guard, and people were rushing and trying to fix and backpedaling in terms of decisions. But if you look at some of the scenarios, we've known for a couple of years that a war will break out in that region. We've known since 2014. And there should have been some sort of scenario that spoke about the fact that Russia will invade the Ukraine, and on top of that, that Russia will use the oil and gas to keep the rest of the world, in particular, keep Europe in control, and certainly make sure that people don't overreact, and obviously the threats of nuclear weapons, etc. So these scenarios are suggested futures, are futures that we try and predict, and we try and anticipate how those would unfold. So if we look at the uncertainties of the future, so the first one, it is the what if plans. Now, one of the what if plans is, what if Russia invades the Ukraine? And it's a reality. We see other sort of areas that are permanent reminders of where the world is going, things like global warming and the threat of pandemics. So each of those what if scenarios then has a range of alternative futures, and in terms of those futures, you plan for them. But in each of those futures, you look for certain trigger points. So when something happens, it means that a particular future is unfolding in terms of the organization's strategic plans. So the key thing is about not under-predicting, and also not about over-predicting. But it is about being ready for different scenarios that may unfold, and in each of those scenarios, looking at those triggers that will pinpoint which scenario is busy unfolding. In terms of scenario analysis and planning, so from a guideline perspective, the first one, look at the key external strategic issues. And again, we know that there's certain things that we have to have on our radar all the time, and that obviously relates to global warming and pandemics. That's always going to be a reality. In terms of scenarios that we create, certainly we need to look at scenarios that include further pandemics. We need to look at scenarios where what will happen when sea levels rise. But there are other elements to consider as well. And again, the war in the Ukraine could have been predicted. And I didn't believe it would happen. I thought it was posturing, and it shows you how little I actually know. So the kinds of things that we can look at, there's certain predetermined elements, and these are stats, and you can see in terms of stats, size, structure of your population. We can see lifestyles. There are trends that evolve over time, and those trends essentially become a reality. And then also to look at the values of the population. And in South Africa, we have a unique situation that values depend often on how much money you have, and the kinds of jobs that you have, and the kinds of realities that you face on a daily basis. The second one is the uncertainties. What will happen from a political change perspective? We saw in the Durban elections how many seats the ANC lost to other parties. Now, the simple truth is it's going to be very interesting to see what happens on the 1st of November, to see where the power base is and what shift in power has happened. And then also economic change. Again, we have to consider the impact of petrol prices and the lack of availability of electricity. And then we look at driving forces. These driving forces are the things that ultimately give a competitive advantage to a specific nation. It's having the right technology. It's having the right kind of education. And then you look at your scenarios, and you look at certain outcomes, and you're constantly asking questions. What has been omitted? What have we overlooked? And also then, is everyone sure that we're on the same page in terms of what will happen to this organization when these different scenarios unfold. And out of that, you then look at these different scenarios and different plans and different sub-elements that will be put in place should a particular scenario unfold. If we look at the characteristics of a good scenario, the first one is relevant. So it looks at the realities of the organization, it looks at the realities of the industry environment, it looks at the reality of the macro environment. So in any scenario now, obviously Ukraine and what Russia will do in terms of the future will feature heavily. It has to be internally consistent. So when you talk about internal consistency, it means if a scenario talks about an increase in petrol prices, then we've got to realize that there will be an associated increase in inflation. And we then need to realize that there'll be an associated increase in interest rates. So we can see that from a logical perspective, these things all link into each other that are internally consistent. Archetypal is that we have very unique scenarios. So, if we think of the two unique scenarios, war in the Ukraine, no war in the Ukraine. War in the Ukraine, we then look at certain trigger points and what will unfold. No war, we then look at different archetypal, opposite scenarios. And then also, I think it should be non-transient, and it should indicate a state that will exist for a long time. And we know that the war in the Ukraine will have a long-term effect in terms of Europe. It's going to have a long-term effect in terms of NATO and NATO membership. So an internally consistent scenario would be the invading the Ukraine would result in more nations joining NATO. So it's internally consistent, it's logical. In terms of why we do a macro environmental analysis, the first one there, it increases managerial awareness of environmental changes. So we become very, very aware of the kinds of things that we need to keep our eyes on. And those are important. I mean, I think the simple truth is organizations sometimes lose focus because they become complacent, because they get into the success groove. And part of a success groove is that it counters the kind of normal intuitive thinking that would go hand in hand with potential changes in the environment. The second one, it gives us a broader idea of the context within which industries operate. So if we look at the auto industry in South Africa and where car prices are going, and obviously the knock-on effect in terms of how second-hand cars have increased in value as well. And those are the kinds of realities and the context for car prices. It's the weak rand, it's steel prices, it's supply and demand. I mean, there's so many variables, but it gives us a broad understanding of the realities of our industry as much as it will give us an understanding of the realities of our organization. It looks at multinational and global issues. Again, the realization that the Ukraine invading Russia will have a huge knock-on effect, including to the extent that I read an article somewhere that cooking oil will increase to something like 200 rand a bottle. I don't know what the two have to do with each other, but again, it's those finer variables that we sometimes don't see the knock-on effect. It also allows us to improve resource allocation decisions. Again, when we look at the floods from 3 weeks ago, we were completely unprepared for it. But if you think from a disaster management perspective, the Durban municipality should have known that this was going to happen. We've been warned since 2019 that this was going to happen. And then also it allows us to reduce the risk and it raises awareness of threats. And for me, it's the early warning signal system. It's like an alarm going off and indicating to you, you need to be aware, you need to get ready, you need to get your ducks in a row. Now, there are a number of limitations, and the first one is that often people get caught off guard. I think changes happen so rapidly. Again, if you look at how quickly COVID happened and how quickly organizations have to respond. Organizations by nature like stability. We have policies and practices and we have certain things in place to essentially promote stability. And what this kind of thing does, it suggests that change is going to be your reality and you should be stable, but in a way that you're ready for the next change. So there are a couple of things that we have to be aware of. The first one is to always remember that you don't have a crystal ball and no one is ever perfect in terms of making predictions about the future. Things will happen that will catch you off guard. The second one is to understand the complexities, the knock-on effect of how one small element in an organization changing will have an impact in terms of other elements changing. And then we need to carry out this analysis continuously. This is not something you do once a year or once every 5 years. And you keep looking for sources of information. So you make sure that you listen to those sort of early warning signals. You pay attention to those suggestions in the environment that are always there, but we tend to ignore because it makes us feel uncomfortable as an organization. And it has to be part of your learning, because one of the things we know, organizations that survive crises and survive change become resilient. And the only way we build resilience is that we build the kind of change and crisis survival into our learning. Guys, and then activity 531, please have a glance at that. And then there is our bibliography